Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Mona Atea. I'm the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at GW, and it's a pleasure to have you join us today for a conversation between Yair Wallach and Shira Robinson. So Dr. Wallach is a senior lecturer in Israeli studies at SOAS, University of London, and his research deals with modernity and its transformative dimensions in Israel-Palestine. Focusing on urban space and visual culture. And we're here today to discuss his book, A City in Fragments, Urban Texts in Modern Jerusalem, which was published in 2020 by Stanford University Press. And he'll be in conversation with our very own Shira Robinson, who's Associate Professor of History and International Affairs here at the George Washington University and a core member of IMIS. Her research focuses on the social and cultural history of the modern Middle East with an emphasis on colonialism, citizenship, nationalism, and cultures of militarism after World War I. And she's the author of Citizen Stranger, Palestine and the Birth of Israel's Liberal Settler State. So I'm going to just briefly give you an overview of the format, and then I'm going to pass the microphone over to Shira. So this is a conversation between the scholars. Shira will be essentially interviewing Yair and engaging him on his book. And after about 45 minutes, we'll open for discussion amongst the audience. And Shana Marshall, who's the associate director here at the Institute, will be moderating. We are allowing both questions to be put in the chat, and also you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you and ask you to ask your question, and then ask you to remute yourself. So we're trying out a new format for the questions because we usually have a pretty manageable audience. Just one final thing, I'd like to thank Christian Clinton, the Institute's operation manager, Elad Raymond, the events assistant, and Carissa, our social media assistant, for all of the work that went into making this event possible, and to welcome Yair and Shira, and thank you so much for your time. Shira?
Thank you so much, Mona and Shana and Christian. And I just want to say I'm so delighted to have Yair Wallach with us today. He's written an extraordinary book, and I just want to say, as a kind of an aside, oftentimes the blurbs on the back are sort of like puff notes, puff pieces, but in this case, they are really, the commentary and the praise on the book is really, really deserved. So Michelle Campos, a historian of Ottoman Palestine and Jerusalem, among other things, writes that the book is an astonishing read and a delightful book. Our understanding of Jerusalem's history will forever be changed by this sensitive and lyrical description of the city, sacred and profane, spiritual and material, and she goes on. And Salim Tamari, also a historian of Ottoman Jerusalem, writes, City in Fragments is a brilliant erudite examination of Jerusalem's Ottoman colonial modernity. And I want to just make note of the fact that he notes that the book is a very anti-nostalgic examination. And I want to come back to that anti-nostalgia in a minute, because it's a really important part of the book. So this is a remarkable and beautifully written book about the transformation and the power of written language in Jerusalem, including, and I quote, the demise of the written language's power to heal and its newly acquired powers to advertise and to embody value, unquote. And rather than chronicling a straight line from orality to literacy, says Yair, the book traces changes in what he calls the textual economies of Arabic and Hebrew, by which he defines as, quote, the production, reproduction, and reception of written artifacts, unquote. And so he kind of tells a story of the transformation of written language and its role in public life, and its role not only as a symbol or reflection of dramatic changes happening in the city and in the broader country, but also as a tool to carry out or enact those very changes. So I'm going to just give you a brief description that comes from his conclusion of what we see in the mid-19th century versus what we see starting in the late 19th century. So in mid-19th century Jerusalem, Yair writes, talking about the written language in the urban landscape, he writes that the appearance of text in Arabic and Hebrew was anchored in the life of religious communities and in the sanctity of the scriptures. The circulation of text was dictated by strict formulaic logic, determining what could be written, where, and in what form. Within these unspoken rules, inscriptions invested sites, objects, and buildings with ideological meaning as well as with heavenly protection. This use of text corresponded to a world in which writing was practiced by few, news was delivered primarily by voice, and urban geography was communicated through oral culture rather than signs. And then by contrast, by the final decades of the 19th century, but especially into the early 20th century, he writes that the religious language lost ground in a new social order dominated by capitalism, nationalism, and colonialism. Text was encountered more frequently around the city, in signs on buildings and shops, public notices, commercial ads, street nameplates, and house numbers. The local sacred quality of Arabic and Hebrew continued to reverberate, but it was harnessed for secular agendas. So Yair goes on to, and the book goes on to describe the transformation of the urban landscape through a number of different, in a number of different textual artifacts. So for example, textual inscriptions on buildings, gold like coins and banknotes, street signs, pilgrims graffiti, sacred embroidered banners, ID identification cards, and visiting cards, which is a thing I had never heard of. So maybe like the proto expression of a business card. And one of the biggest changes that he chronicles is the ways in which new texts sought to mark territory by naming or by categorizing people. So one of the things that's really interesting to me about this book is that it is a book that clearly departs from a kind of conventional political narrative about Israel-Palestine, even though the stories that it chronicles are deeply steeped deeply in politics, specifically colonial and nationalist politics. So he talks about the implications of the dramatic events and turning points like World War I, the rise of the Zionist movement, the growth of Jewish immigration, clashes between Arabs and Jews in 1920, 1929, and other 1936. But he takes a different approach to these political events or to excavating them. And he takes Walter Benjamin's notion or model of a historian as a rag picker, which is like a lovely image, what he calls a scavenger in the trash of history who searches for discarded objects. And those objects, he goes on to describe, again, building on Benjamin, can be used to create a collage that, quote, has the power to call into question narratives of history as progress. By assembling together the random, fragmented, and half obliterated traces of the mundane, the deep configuration of modernity can be grasped. So this leads me, Yair, to my very first question, which is that you have a very evocative line in your conclusion, which also recalls the very first pages of your book about the old Ottoman train station in Jerusalem that now sits in ruins and whose line to Jaffa has been bulldozed to make room for a broad boulevard with shops and restaurants, along with a very kind of small exhibition kind of for play's sake. It's not really a serious exhibition based on what you wrote, and a few photos. And you write of ghosts telling different stories of this train station. And I'm wondering if you can explain what you mean by this, by the ghosts telling different stories of the train station as a way of introducing us to your remarkable book, why you wrote it, and why you wrote it using the methodology that you did.
So the ghost, I think that, the first ghost that I think of is Khalil Sakakini, the Palestinian intellectual educator. And he lived for several years opposite the station in Al Harriya building, this kind of warehouse complex, which is now today a theater. And so and he's someone that's, used the railway, obviously, and was a great believer in progress, modernity, and so forth. And I mean, he's the first one that I think of. Now, so to zoom out, I think this is, as part of the research, I read lots of memoirs and diaries and so forth. And I was born in Jerusalem and grew up this part of my childhood there. So I had my idea of the city, what the city is, what its past is, and so forth. And reading very closely these memoirs and diaries and other sources, something really very different emerged. And I could hear these people, and these people are not, they're usually not, they get a line maybe in the histories of the conflict, but they're not the center stage because they were not the politicians. And whether it's Wasef Jawhariya or Khalil Sakakini or other people who wrote their memoirs, I mean, when you read carefully and then when you go around the city, and of course you're going to see what they saw and their experiences, but which is partly relates to buildings that are still there and partly not. And that created a sense of alienation for me, which was liberating in a way, but also made me see the city in a new light, and particularly the late Ottoman city. I think and the late Ottoman city in some ways still there because it survived into the Mandate period. And, in many ways during that period, Jerusalem was a post-Ottoman city, and it continued that. So most of the urban fabric is still there. So if you want to, you can see it. But the meaning of the city, the way we think of it is really the creation of the British Mandate, and which then got translated into Israeli narrative and so forth, or the conflict narratives. To be able to see what comes before that, and that kind of moment of Jerusalem as a kind of emerging modern center, then I had to go back to these voices, and that's kind of what the ghosts are. And in a way, I think if you don't have that, if you just go to the train station, it looks like a nice developed, there's cafes and stuff, and there's a very sanitized narrative, which is but this is the product of European imported progress into the Middle East, and kind of Zionism is brought into this, although had nothing to do with the train station. So to break free from that and to think of the people that actually use that station, I think that's kind of seeing through other eyes. Another example is, when I went to the Imperial War Museum to look at old photographs, and I saw the entourage of the Haile Selassie leaving the city at some point. I mean, they came to Jerusalem at some point, they left, there was no context, just these solemn aristocrats, African aristocrats, sitting there in a train in the station. That kind of implied a completely different way of looking at this place, which I could never understand really. But these experiences are really good to jolt at least me out of what I had in mind, what Jerusalem was. And I kind of tried to bring as much as that into the book, either explicitly or in other ways that didn't make it into the book. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I want to just talk a little bit about your methodology as it pertains to thinking about reading and writing and the role that text plays in the urban landscape. I am not well steeped in the language or the writing of Derrida or de Certeau or Lefebvre or even Walter Benjamin, but I got a lot out of what you wrote. And I just want to sort of note a few things that you talked about the sort of using textuality and the sort of social theories of everyday life as a way to historicize the modern textual landscape that, as you write, and as I agree, that we now take for granted, and including in Jerusalem, where I've spent a significant amount of time in my adult life. And I should add, is the city where my maternal grandmother and her entire family lived from the early 19th century until the early 20th century. They left after World War I. You talk about how text cannot be reduced to abstract meaning, that it is never autonomous. You talk about how writing and reading are embodied social practices, and how the book's goal is to outline the processes of dematerialization through which text was increasingly understood as an external referent, and thereby acquired new powers of signification. To ignore actual texts, you explain, is to distinguish between reading and living. And you write that histories of the book have essentialized reading as a private and isolated experience. And I just wanted to ask you if you can elaborate on where you situate yourself within the historical literature and this theoretical literature on the relationship between textuality and everyday life, because you're taking on a lot of big social theorists. And I also just wanted to note, as an aside, as someone who does not write about text per se at all, or the urban landscape at all, I was struck by the ways in which what you're saying about how the ways in which you seek to outline the processes of dematerialization reminds me a lot of the ways in which people seek to unpack the sort of the essentialness of the state itself. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I was wondering if you could reflect on that.
Okay, so I think I think I think a lot of people writing about the history of writing kind of come through it through the experience of books, and I think especially intellectuals, academics, and so forth, especially people kind of working in 60s, 70s, where that's the main, before computer screens take on. So the idea, that's very, I think that, and when I started the project in the 2000s, kind of my intuition was the text is changing, that the way we read and write today is kind of profoundly changed, has now profoundly changed with the internet and so forth. And therefore, we should, text has a history, which is obvious, but that history is not, if we see it purely through the history of the book, it's not sufficient, I think. That's because there's text exists also and has existed outside the book in a variety of media and formats, and operated differently in different contexts. I mean, I talk here about an Islamic and Jewish context in Ottoman, post-Ottoman, etc. It would be very, very different looking at Southeast Asia or other contexts. I think that's really, now, I think if you take, one approach that we see sometimes to look at modern textuality as, if you look at it as a kind of the tool of capitalism or state, and to look at it as a kind of the grid that is enforced upon us, and to see it as a kind of instrument of power that catalogs and locks you in your place, whether it's your ID card, the census, whether it's street names on the map or in real life and so forth. These are for power and for the state to control your life in one way or another. And that's a very kind of dark reading of how text operates. And the way, why Walter Benjamin was really important for me, because he sees that. I mean, he sees that street names, for example, are introduced in Paris, late 18th, 19th century. It's clearly about the state. It's clearly about control. And yet he also thinks that, that control is not everything, and you can actually read against the grain. And I think he wouldn't say it in these terms, but I think, that the state cannot control the way that people read stuff. They can try, but they can't. And so on the one hand, he is very carefully aware of this kind of variety of whether it's shop signs, enamel shop signs, or street names, or other kind of forms of textuality, or billboards. And he's really fascinated by these. And I don't know many other intellectuals of the 20th century that are really talking about this so much. I mean, he has a whole book that is about that and organized about that, One-Way Street, kind of a short. So he's obsessed with it to some degree, and it's very much present in the Arcades project. But he doesn't see it as merely as state intervention, as kind of power and so forth. He sees that it's not just about rationalization. It's also about kind of writing certain mythologies into or modern urban life, from the side of the advancements in the capitalist, the kind of the phantasmagoria of capitalism. But he also sees that once that is there, these mythologies take on their own life and they kind of work in different ways. And his way is kind of to take this and read it differently and find emancipatory and revolutionary promise there. Now, whether that exists or not, I think that's, maybe sometimes you read it and it's too optimistic about these possibilities. But at the same time, I think it's very clear, that even as the state more and more tries to control text, it is deeply fearful of text, because the more you try to control a thing, you kind of give it a certain power, and the danger of text out of control becomes much bigger. So in a way, the British, and I see that the British are much more fearful of text in the wrong place than the Ottomans, who seem, at least until First World War, kind of not bothered about, use of Hebrew, for example. They don't see it as a problem. And that's that anxiety that is created by the state's attempt to control. I think that kind of creates the room for the kind of counter possibilities that Benjamin is talking about. So that's kind of in theoretical terms.
Can you give us, for the people who haven't read the book or who've only had a chance to skim it, can you give us some kind of vivid examples from the book that you talk about in terms of the ways in which the British try, or the Ottomans before them, in terms of the land registration contracts and things like that, the ways that the state uses text to try to control or maintain its gaze over the population, or to control it and to make it legible, but then also the ways in which those forms of control can be turned on their head and made into emancipatory tools. Just because we're sort of talking in the upper stratosphere, and I want to round it for the audience.
So I think the most clear is, when you house numbering. And so when the Suraya Pasha, the Ottoman governor of Jerusalem, introduces house numbering in 1858, the population is deeply resentful of this. And, the reason that is quoted is superstition. But I think it's not superstition to think that if the state comes and mark your house, that's probably bad news. Because it means taxation, it means conscription, it means greater knowledge and disciplinary power of the state. So, and that's the kind of, and that's the first instance. And that comes with the reform of land registration, which doesn't change the law or the rules about land so much as the process of registration creates an upheaval that takes a lot of land from a lot of people. So just the kind of the act of writing, which is supposed to document things as they are, actually is a process through which dispossession operates. And I think we see it in the late 19th century. Of course, we see it until today. I think that, and that's in the occupied territories and elsewhere. So we have house numbering, and we have a population register, and the need for birth certificates and identification papers, which just then means that there's a document that says your name and where you live, and you need it for a variety of purposes. Then becomes much more serious during the First World War, where you can, if you don't have these right papers, you can be executed because you're a deserter from the army and so forth. So these kind of things become absolutely crucial. So the state is increasing its, the state wants to seeing like the state, Scott's formulation, and that means writing and reading you as a citizen, or your house, or your street, or your neighborhood, and so forth. What we see with the British is in some ways continuation of that pattern. What is new is that the British are very much more obsessed about the meaning and writing narratives through text than the Ottomans before that, and that's through names, place naming especially. So they understand the Ottomans. They chose names to all the neighborhoods, and they had official names, but these names did not have to be signposted anywhere, and they didn't mind if the local residents put a different sign. That wasn't an issue. At least until things are a bit different during the war, but that's just a period of 3-4 years. With the British, it's from the very beginning, how do you call this country? Okay, and naming the country to start with, naming it Palestine in Arabic, but also in Hebrew, Palestina, Eretz Israel, and the political implications of naming as giving new meanings for the country as a whole, and creating the country as a separate unit, and then to the local level of street naming as a way to manage relations between communities and to tell you if this is a Jewish street or a Muslim street or a Christian street, so that the perception is already the city is segregated, and we just have to map these different communities where they live, and to rewrite the story, the meaning of the city, and that this is and it's very, very clear through street naming, saying this is a biblical holy city, and therefore all the streets have to reflect it, and so all the streets have to be named after prophets or saints or kings and so forth. So that and that's very, very different from the late Ottoman city, which is primarily interested in quite brutal forms of development and not so much about, this kind of biblical remaking. And so then the governor of Jerusalem, his house is on the most kind of prestigious kind of upper class house in Jerusalem, and he calls it Street of the Prophets, probably referring also to himself, but of course to the Bible and so forth. And that's before that he's known as the Consulate Streets in Hebrew and the Italian Hospital Street in Arabic. So these kind of things, and I think the way we think about Jerusalem as an ancient city, Jerusalem, ancient, holy city, is very much written into the street corners of Jerusalem through these kind of signs, which also in visual terms kind of are designed to echo the Dome of the Rock. So the idea that this city is holy, on a street that is just 10 years old, it's completely modern street and so forth. And that's a very powerful narrative. And the result is that the city that is 99.5 of the urban fabric of Jerusalem is built after 1900, pretends to be this kind of ancient, yes, there's a very small ancient part, but overwhelmingly, most of the city is newer than Manhattan. So, and that kind of myth making is very much on the British mind, and it works in that sense. So that's the, I think that's the kind of, from the side of the authorities. On the kind of grassroots level, there's a variety of levels of kind of working with it, resisting it, reading it differently, that I kind of explore, and mainly through Khalil Sakakini and Jabra Ibrahim Jabra, kind of taking on these news, but kind of reading them differently or using them differently. Or there's a kind of the gesture of kind of ignoring the sign. So you say you call it, I don't know what name street, but I'm just gonna keep referring it in the old name. And that's also we see. So there's a various of responses that kind of go against that logic.
I want to kind of pick up on something that you were just talking about. And one of the things that I love most about your book are the ironies that emerge around the transformation of the urban landscape, that textual landscape, that play out in each of your chapters, and particularly once the British arrive. So you have this sort of, on the one hand, you have the revival of Ottoman Jerusalem in the late 19th century. And on the other hand, after 1917, you have this emergence of a kind of fetishism, historicist fetishism of the British mandatory regime, and their assumption and writing into the narrative of the city of a sectarian conflict that didn't exist as they kind of didn't exist before they created it, essentially. And so some of the ironies that I'm talking about include, and this is something that you were sort of alluding to, the British project of conservation, which included a lot of destruction and demolition, not only of street names or of sort of names of places and neighborhoods, but also like actual monuments like the clock tower, the ways in which the aim of street naming by the British was to purge Jerusalem of its modernity and of its architectural modernity as well, the ways in which there was this regulation that was put in place that exists to this day, that all buildings all new buildings had to be draped in stone. The ways in which, but there were other ironies too, the ways in which the British Palestinian banknotes, which were new at the time and which had nothing to do, the emergence of which, the introduction of which had nothing to do with economic policy per se, but rather had everything to do with support for the policy of supporting the Jewish national home. These banknotes were a source of grievance among Palestinians at the time because of their introduction of Hebrew onto the currency. And yet now they've become a source of nostalgia by Palestinian activists and older people who sort of want to remember the golden age of the British mandatory period before the emergence of the Israeli state. There were other ironies as well, the ways in which I wrote in my notes, and you kind of allude to this term also or you use this term in one of your chapters, the ways in which the kind of Zionification or Zionist transformation of the Western Wall led to the erasure of Jewish cultural memory and tradition, namely the tradition of pilgrim graffiti inscription or chiseling, in the name of that very same cultural memory and tradition. The ways in which the Nebi Musa banners, the banners of the Nebi Musa festival in honor of the prophet Moses, were displaced and suppressed not only by British regulations, but also by the Palestinian national movement, because those banners were not sufficiently nationalist or Arabist. And I'm wondering if what you think are the most sort of starkest examples of these kinds of ironies or vivid that you discovered, and if you could just elaborate on one or two of them for the audience, because they're all really remarkable stories.
So one story is the Palestinian flag, which is designed by Mark Sykes, and he's designing it as an instrument to basically delude and kind of lead the Arabs the wrong way. And he's aware that the French are coming to Syria, and he's aware that the Arabs, Arab nationalists do not want the French. So it's a way to kind of compensate for that. Let's have a flag so we can fly it everywhere. So you don't realize that this is a colonial, divide and rule, takeover basically. And then, so and then he kind of, he initiates design, which is in consultation with Sharif Hussein, and then the flags. And then the flags are received enthusiastically in Syria. And also in Palestine later, but first, like when Emir Faisal is there, and it's the Arab flag of liberation. So on the one hand, you have Mark Sykes, the arch-villain of British colonial policy, designing the Arab national flag, which then later becomes the Palestinian flag. On the other hand, by the 20s, the British don't, ban the flag in Palestine. So that what they designed themselves goes out of control and becomes the symbol of colonial, anti-colonial nationalism. So these, I think the flexibility of these things is kind of striking until today. And I think the fact that the Palestinian flag is the Arab flag, the general Arab flag, that kind of by default remained the Palestinian flag, is kind of interesting, because that's the kind of the only place where the Arabs didn't get independence or didn't get some kind, and so that kind of means that the issues we're talking about go back a century. I think that's kind of one of the ways I see it. This is, this is one thing that kind of strikes me. Another thing is I think if we look at the kind of enthusiasm for modernity that we find in Jabra Ibrahim Jabra as the Palestinian novelist that kind of grew up as in a very poor family in Bethlehem and then moving to Jerusalem. And his way out, a way to social mobility was through a school that was set up by the British mandate, and then to go to Cambridge. And there's a lot of kind of combination of Nahda style Arabism, kind of post-Nahda, that reads very naive and Orientalist, I think, today. So that kind of idea that Arab culture is frozen, it has to be, it has to be chucked, well, let's keep a few things, but let's really learn from the West. I think that's kind of reads tragic, I think, today, to think that people that, really believed in some kind of project that then made them, not directly, but made them refugees. I think that's a kind of tragic to see. So there's the kind of quite, sad implication of that. Or the kind of, if we talk about Khalil Sakakini as someone who, firm believer in kind of taking on influences from the West, and reading a lot and being open, and non-sectarianism, and famously hiding a Jewish acquaintance in his house during the war from the Ottomans, and then going to prison over this, etc. Someone like him becoming a refugee and losing his home and his library towards the end of his life, that's kind of tragic. So yes, there's kind of more funny and the more sad ironies of that. But I think these, for me, these contradictions are really important, because I think that's the only way to make sense of history, is to see it as a kind of struggle between various tensions, etc. And if we tell a simple story, we just miss, I think, the important parts. I think to see this kind of game of contradictions and tensions and what emerge out of them is it, at least that's the way I think of things, and that's kind of where you can also see risks, but also possibilities. I think that's kind of where the, if there's any room for optimism, that's where it's coming from.
Yeah, I mean, your book was really sad, I have to admit it. I mean, there were a lot of funny parts, and there was a lot of astonishment on my part. As Michelle Campos wrote, it's an astonishing book. I mean, there were just so many stories of, there were a lot of things I had taken for granted, even though I lived in Jerusalem, maybe because I lived in Jerusalem for so long, doing my own research. But there is a lot of tragedy in the story that you tell, particularly in the loss of civic pluralism. And Shana or Christian, Mona, do we have time for me to keep going, or do you want to? Yes. Okay. So, so some of the themes that you touch on and the literature that you build on is very clear. Like the ways in which you're building on the existing historiography on this period in late Ottoman Palestine. And the way that you're furthering it. So, for example, your literature, your discussion of the Nahda, the Arab kind of literary cultural renaissance, and the Haskalah, the Hebrew Enlightenment, the ways in which those kind of participated in and fed into Ottoman modernism, as opposed to the story of the sort of old narrative of within the Zionist and kind of European Western historiographic tradition of that Europe and the Zionist movement were the agents of modernity in Ottoman Palestine, or in Palestine in general. These are currents that are emerging, percolating from below, both in Europe in terms of Jews immigrating to Palestine, but also in terms of Arab intellectuals and writers, and sort of coming from the Ottoman modernists from Turkey and from the state. You also talk about, you have a very clear message about sort of the importance of the culture of civic pluralism in Ottoman Palestine, as opposed to the culture that the British kind of assumed and wrote into the landscape, which was one of the clash of civilization. You write about urban modernity, and you write about literacy, and all of these things are sort of, for scholars of this period and of the late 19th and early 20th century, there's something that we recognize these bodies of literature in your story. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about in terms of the categories of historiographic registers in which your book is intervening is about relational history. And you talk, and relational history is a model of the really of the ways in which historians began to, in the late 1990s, the mid-1990s, began to talk, people like Zach Lockman, Gershon Shafir, and others, Salim Tamari, started to write about the ways in which Jews and Arabs in Palestine were not separated or segregated, and that was what caused the conflict, but rather the conflict the rise of Zionism and the nationalist conflict was what separated these people, Jews and Arabs in Palestine. And also that these scholars were particularly invested in the ways in which Jewish society and Arab society made each other, rather than just always living in separate parallel lives and living through separate parallel trajectories. And so, Yair, you talk in your book about, you talk a lot about rituals and textual transformations in common, in terms of Judaism and Hebrew, Islam and Arabic. And you talk about these communities living in many ways parallel lives, but you talk less about mutual influence and mutual social formation in the ways that Zach Lockman does in talking about the mandate, for example. And you note in your conclusion and a little bit in your introduction that the various communities in Jerusalem had more interaction than was assumed in the past, but you don't dwell on that in specific terms, save an anecdote here or there. So my question for you is, has relational history as a model of writing about Israel-Palestine, has that run its course as far as you're concerned? Have we said all that we need to say about that? Have we kind of figured that story out, but it kind of remains of limited value now moving forward? Or does your story about urban textuality in Jerusalem just happen to sit at a remove from that narrative model? And so, for example, this might sound very abstract, but let me try to make it more concrete. For example, why was the Nebi Musa festival timed to coincide with Easter? Was this about, at the time, was this about recalling and maintaining Christian-Muslim rivalry, or was it about inviting non-Muslims in to partake in the celebrations because it was anyway a kind of holiday time because of Easter and presumably Passover? So I wondered if you can talk a little bit about the tension that's in your book between lives and societies and religious communities in parallel, operating in parallel versus influencing each other. And
Yeah.
this question has enormous implications for the rest of the historiographic debate in Palestine, because for a long time, the Zionist movement argued that its policies in Palestine were not going to come at the expense of Palestinian Arabs. Rather, the Jews were just, the Zionist community and the Jewish settlement community was just doing its thing, living its lives in parallel with Palestinians. And then all of a sudden there was a war in 1948, and it was a miracle that the Israeli state was born.
Okay, so there's a few things here, maybe come back. So first about Nebi Musa, I mean, the tradition is that it's established by Saladin, Salahuddin, the pilgrimage, and it's designed to counter the presence of Christian pilgrims. And so, after defeating the Crusaders and kicking them out, there's a need to, it's a dangerous time of the year where lots of Christians come. So we need to make sure that there's a counterbalance by Muslim presence. I mean, that's the kind of typical narrative. It's probably true. Where the origins, why is it timed? Because it's the only Muslim festival that's it's timed according to, basically the Christian calendar. And it's not about Passover, that wasn't the issue, but it's really about Easter and kind of making sure that the Christians don't use the moment to somehow do something. Mm-hmm. And that's history is kind of captured in the fact that there's sword fighting. It's not really, it's ritualistic, but there's something of a conquest. It's a re-celebration of conquest, basically, of the city by the Muslims and recapturing. That's Nebi Musa. The question about relationship history in general, so okay, I don't think it's run its course at all. In my case, because I was talking about textual economies, so if we think of text as an economy, which includes various things, it includes, print shops, handbills, signs, etc. So there are quite distinct textual economies, let's put it, use the term, that are parallel, that are not. So if I talk about, and they're not necessarily pan-Jewish, so there's an Ashkenazi one that is very, even though it's in Hebrew, so it's legible to all Jews, but really it's for Ashken, it's especially when you look at the Pashkevilim, the handbills, as a kind of way to, as a kind of public space, that's very much, in Hebrew, for Hebrew readers. There's not many, so how many people could read them that were not Jewish and so forth? So that's, in that sense, there is some kind of parallel things going on here. However, I would say, first of all, we do see awareness of others' texts. I think that's, so to give one example, inscriptions, stone inscriptions. So in the kind of one of the water fountains, and the text is quoted in this Ashkenazi newspaper in the 1850s. So the full text of the Arabic inscription. So people were aware, and I think that's the kind of idea that I'm trying to communicate, that it's not, literacy is not really about, you don't really have to read the proper thing. But if you're aware that this is an inscription in Arabic and it's about the Sultan Suleiman, and that's enough to have, it plays a role in your life. It means something to you. You understand, it means something about the space you're in, even if you're an Ashkenazi migrant from Belarus. And the same about the Tugra, the emblem of, and I think that's something that is relevant to everyone. I think kind of trying to make that point that it's, that emblem of the Sultan, which becomes the logo of the Ottoman state, and then appears in a variety, and appears on your birth certificates, etc. So it doesn't matter who you are. So, and that is very clear that it plays a role in the life of Jews. I bring this because the rule was that on small coins, if the tugra is worn, you can't, the shop owners won't receive it, won't take it. Mm-hmm. So there's these stories about how kids try to, they use the time of dusk to pay with the worn coins. And these are Jewish Sephardic kids. Okay, so in that sense, and I think that's where we see the intersection of different kind of, and I have other examples. So that's a kind of more nice part of the history. Where the relation history is more, I think you can see it in the book, is when it comes to then the banknotes or street names, which are trilingual. So that's where you see the kind of, everybody can read it, and if they don't read it, understand what it means everything for everyone. And that kind of contestation over that and what it means cannot, I don't think you can tell the story if you just focus on one community. So that would be my answer. Although most, as I said, a lot of things that, I could have talked about, but they're not significant enough. The fact that there were Jewish kids, there were Jewish kids in Islamic schools. There were Muslim and Christian kids in Jewish schools. The censor for Hebrew newspaper at some point is either from the Khaldi or the Husseinis, I can't remember. I mean, there's a level of, there's Hebrew scholars, Jewish scholars coming to the Chaldean library, all these things. I'm not sure how, I'm not making a claim that everybody could read each other's language. That's definitely not the case. Many people couldn't read at all. But it does mean, I think that Ibrahim Jabra, the trilingual sign at the end of Bethlehem, I think means something for him, a boundary. And that is somehow connected to the presence of Orthodox Jews coming to pray there. These things somehow interlocks, and they're kind of part of what his world means. So, so in that sense, I don't think, the alternative, the alternative to relation history would be to assume that you have already existing, fully fledged national communities, etc. That's obviously not the case. I think in, my current project is, and I'm thinking about the acculturation, integration of Ashkenazi Jews in our society and culture. And that's a really, really important question. Where does the distinction between the migrant and the settler lies? And I think, and a lot of the people I'm talking about on the Jewish side, they at least start as migrants rather than settlers. Mm-hmm. And that means a certain kind of patterns, various patterns of integration that is possible. And I don't think you can think, I think part of the reason that all this is written out of history is because of the kind of the dual society model that is still very much with us, even at least in public imagination, if not in the historiography.
Are there any questions? Because I have another one.
I don't see any hands raised, and I don't have any questions in the chat. So
All right, well, this is about the end of your book, Yair, and your discussion about the present. And you kind of beat me to the punch because I was like halfway through your conclusion and I started having all these thoughts to myself about the 21st century. And I'm like, oh, surely this is going to be a new question for him. But then I saw that you did it yourself. But so I want to just build on that part of your conclusion. You note the shifting tides of textual expression in the 21st century with the rise of digital technology, the internet, social media, and I would add the life of hashtags like number signs, save Sheikh Jarrah, for example, to bring a very recent example. And this is fascinating to me, and I'd love to hear your take on what this shifting tides look like in the context of Israel-Palestine, your kind of meta bird's eye overview or take of that. It also occurs to me, though, that tactile signs, the kinds of signs that you're writing about in terms of street names, for example, still have remarkable staying power in Israel-Palestine. So here I'm thinking of a few examples. One is the story told in Shari Plonsky's recent book about power, resistance, and the struggle over space, about how Palestinian citizens of Israel have been papering over street signs named in so-called mixed cities where Palestinians and Jews live in the same city. They're papering over street signs named after Zionist symbols and heroes with names of their Palestinian counterparts. I'm also thinking of the early work of the NGO and nonprofit group Zochrot, which means memories, plural, and which is an organization that was founded during the height of the Second Intifada, or maybe just before it, which sought to instill in Israeli Jewish society the consciousness about the Nakba, the dispossession of 1948. And Zochrot, one of the things that it did in the early 2000s, and I know this because I went on tours with them, was they would put up signs on the outskirts of Jewish kibbutzim and other settlements indicating the names of the Palestinian villages that had been destroyed in 48 and that were in the place of those kibbutzim and other settlements. And what would happen with Zochrot is they would put up these signs and they would be taken down by the kibbutznikim or by the other Jews living in these local communities almost immediately, almost as if they were threatened by the sort of the ghosts of their land, of the land that they were living on, the lands of the villages that were depopulated and the refugees themselves. You yourself note, you have a very vivid story in your conclusion about the students at the Orthodox Jewish, at the yeshiva, the Orthodox Jewish seminary that has taken over one of the schools that you talk about in the book, founded in the mid-19th century by German Jews, founded as a secular German school that was originally open to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And the yeshiva students in the 21st century replaced the original cosmopolitan bilingual sign with a sign in Hebrew only. And I don't remember what it said, what the sign said, but it was almost something hostile to that cosmopolitan memory. And so I'm wondering if I'm reading these things correctly, that tactile signs still have remarkable staying power in Israel-Palestine. And I'm wondering if this is true, is the ongoing importance of signage and the naming of place uniquely prominent in the context of Israel-Palestine because of the ongoing settler colonial conflict? Or am I just not paying as much attention to other parts of the world? In other words, to what extent is the remarkable staying power of concrete tactile signage unique to Israel-Palestine, or is it here with us to stay? We're not going to go all digital completely and forget, just like we didn't actually forget the book or forget about the book as something you can hold in your hand. We're not going to forget about signs.
Okay, so there's lots there. I mean, I think one thing that is interesting about the new kind of digital age is that the circulation is less controllable than it was before. And so one of the ways in which these things have staying power is through images, right? And now that's not entirely new. And I think in a way we can see it already in the late 19th century that the photography dictates a new way of signposting a building, because you want a sign that is big enough to be seen in the photograph and legible. And that kind of, so that's why you don't do stone inscriptions anymore, because nobody can read it in the photograph, and you need it in the photograph because that's part of your propaganda. But when you can disseminate this on the internet in a kind of a much unprecedented way, that, you know, that takes a life of its own, and you don't need to be there. And if you're barred from going there, again, I mean, that makes it even more. And I think, I think 20th century modern text is, a lot of it tried to create these kind of stable hierarchies and forms of categorization that by themselves were opening up space for resistance, but that's the attempt. And I think with the internet, things are much more flat and networked, and it's impossible to create these hierarchies anymore. I think that kind of the gesture that we give business cards to each other, it's touching. It's kind of, it's as if, I mean, these things had actual meaning in 1930. If you had someone's card, that was significant. Today, what does it mean? It doesn't mean anything. I mean, you can look them up on the internet. Why did, I mean, I'm not sure why we do this still. So that is a much more unstable world that we live in which these things continue to circulate as kind of fragments and images, and have a life of their own. I would say that I'm worried about, or kind of, I'm trying to be cautious about the fetishization of these artifacts. I mean, that's the, you know, and because, and in a way that's part, you know, and I've been on the Zohot's tours, and I know their signs, etc. And I think that signposting is also a colonial practice. And I think we have to be aware that when we use something that is about a claim to, you know, to territory and meaning and so forth, we are using something that came from that context. And therefore we should be aware of the limitations, the dangers involved in this. I'm not against the signs, but, and so forth. And so when people say, what was the name of the street before? It already assumes a certain view of how you think of space, which is not the way that people thought about space in many places in Jerusalem. And, you know, I mean, and in a way, it kind of, so we are firmly in that kind of zero-sum game that either it's that name or that name, you know, while before the sign, nobody cared what you called them, you know, nobody tried to force you to, so that's why I'm, sorry.
Very cute.
So nobody, so I think that's the risk of kind of a very simple approach to saying, and it depends where, but in Jerusalem still, I mean, I think the way to think of space is mainly through, in East Jerusalem, it's mainly through, you know, what opposite which building and where next to the post office, etc. That's the way you describe where you live, rather than I live in Anarchist 38th Street, etc. And that's this kind of Cartesian model of street name plus number, etc. That is something that was introduced from outside. Now, you know, and so I think, you know, I'm trying, otherwise I think we go into a quite flat discourse about geography and kind of lose what was lost. Now, I don't think we can go back to, you know, days before street names probably, but I think I want us to be aware of that.
Thank you. I think we should open it up to questions.
Yeah, I do have a couple questions. We'll go to Alyssa, who's a PhD student here at GW first, because Ari has questions, but I know he'd want Alyssa to have her question foregrounded. It relates to literacy rates. Did you find that the highly unequal literacy rates between the Jewish community and the Palestinian Arab community during the mandate period affected the way those different communities perceived the written word in the city? Basically, how did that type of inequality factor into their interactions with text?
So I think, some things are obvious and it's clear that there's much higher rates of literacy among Jews. Again, it's not even Sephardi women, not necessarily. Literacy was not universal, but that changes. Christians were, much higher rates of literacy than Muslims. But during the mandate, that does change with access to at least primary education, and especially in a place like Jerusalem. So, and we can see this in memoirs like Jabra's or Said Wish or others. What was important for me, in that sense, I'm more a cultural historian than a social historian, is to say that the meaning of literacy changes and the meaning of text changes. And I think we lose that when we just focus on rates, etc., because if just talking about Jewish communities, where among men at least, the literacy levels are similar. But when you look at the Ashkenazim, this is everything is done through published, printed handbills and so forth. And that's kind of, you don't see it with the Sephardi community. So with the Ashkenazim, you have this kind of economy of paper, and which comes with print shops, come with products that they produce, that come with, the whole community is around printed material, and it's not the same with the Sephardi. So it's not just about whether you know to read and write, but it's kind of how you use text and how you view text. And it's also the same is true. It's very clear when we talk about Talbiya, the Arab bourgeois neighborhood, where literacy was universal, but nobody put street names. They didn't bother, they didn't see the point. And Hala Sakakini's daughter, takes pride of that. We didn't have street names. Everybody knew each other. There's no need for this, etc. While where you do see active attempt of street namings in the Jewish neighborhood come from both Orthodox and from the Zionist organizations. So there's various different agendas of why you put street names and what names you use, but very conscious ones. Again, this is not about literacy, but rather about how you use text and for what purpose and what does it mean. In the same way, I think, for the people that came from the Nabi Musa, parades and pilgrimage, most of them, the villagers, couldn't read exactly what was written on the banners. I don't think it mattered. I think they understood this is, somebody told them what was written, and I'm sure they could identify the Shahada. But that doesn't suffice when you're moving to a different age and you want to read the newspaper headlines. Even if you can read the Shahada, or you can read a few other things, and that's when there's a quest from literacy. There's a story in Jabra. He teaches an old stonemason how to read, so he can read the headlines in Palestine to understand the political drama that is taking place. And that's very different from when you read a text in church or in mosque, etc. So that I'm more interested in that aspect than the question and it's more, and admittedly, it's more difficult to quantify, what does it mean exactly to what layers of the population when they acquire new skills. I think we can see it very clearly anecdotally with Jabra Ibrahim Jabra. It's very much in there in the memoirs. I don't know how to generalize it. And we have to remember, this is Jerusalem. This is not a small village, I don't know, south of Hebron or whatever, where there was much less access to schooling. So it's not necessarily representative of Palestine, but it is, I think, maybe tells us something about the new layer of urban readers in places like Jerusalem or Jaffa as well.
Great, thank you. So the first question from Ari is about naming practices during the British mandatory period. He says, I agree with you 100%, and I'd add that I often encountered cases in which the British colonial administrators justify their acts and believe that by giving a certain place a British or an imperial name, they are performing a kind of Solomonic trial and that they're giving it a neutral name. This is a colonial practice that refuses to recognize its own domination by convincing itself that it is not part of the sectarian conflict, or that the West is by definition non-sectarian. Would you agree with this? And is this one of the ironies that Shira alluded to earlier?
Absolutely. I think it's really important for the British to construct the population as sectarian, and then that constructs them, etc., as above it all, right? And they're the only ones who can manage it, because these people would kill each other once. If we went here, the quarreling sects, and I think I is referring to the fast hotel that was renamed Allenby Hotel, and Governor Storrs, the governor of Jerusalem, in his really interesting memoir. So he says, so there was this hotel, it was German owned, so that the Germans were kicked to some kind of detention camp in Egypt, and they took over the property. And how do you name you have to give it a new name. So the Jews wanted Solomon and the Arabs wanted Suleiman. So Storrs decided to call it the Allenby Hotel as a kind of act of kind of a compromise. I really doubt the story. I don't buy it, but I mean, and I don't think they would have a problem to call it Suleiman and Shlomo. I don't think so, but that's how Storrs chooses to tell the story. But I think that kind of, and I think that's absolutely crucial to the British plan, because the British assume that there is no local identity that is beyond these sectarian identities. And in the same way that they do in India. I mean, you're either Hindu or Muslim, or but and therefore there's no point even trying, because these are just sects that kind of are at each other's throats. And at least in 1918, when that's really not the case, you have an urban middle class that is cross-sectarian, and you have figures that are widely appreciated. So if you wanted to do something to construct a unifying identity, you could name the street after mayors that were quite popular you could name a street after the Sephardic rabbi of the late 9th century, which was held in esteem by everyone. And so you could find the characters that had appeal and that could, to create some kind of common language. They very deliberately, I don't think it even crosses their mind that that's a possibility. And therefore, of course, we end up in a possibility of partition later, because, anything that is not partition or some kind of division would be artificial in their minds. So I think, yes, it's absolutely correct, really.
Great. Thank you. This will be, I think, the last question, also from Ari. He says, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts and reflections about what is the state of the art when it comes to the study of Jerusalem. For many years, the study of 19th and 20th century Jerusalem was carried out by geographers and historical geographers, and a strong emphasis was put on the mandatory period. Today, we have a richer body of scholarship. We know more about the late Ottoman period. There are impressive projects like Open Jerusalem, etc. Would you be willing briefly to give us the rough contours of the scholarly literature on that, and then tell us where your book enters into dialogue with that scholarship?
So I think I would start with the Jerusalem Quarterly, which is a kind of published by the Institute of Palestine Studies. That's an amazing body of work for now 20 years that really challenged the way that on which Jerusalem was written about by Israeli geographical historians like Ben Aryeh and Karg, but also by Martin Gilbert and various other historians. And Salim Tamari was absolutely pivotal here. I think he's a kind of the grand father figure of this, and also I think what Tamari did was shift or to create interest in the late Ottoman period, because that, first of all, it's interesting in itself and a revision of the historiography, but also it allows us to see the post-Ottoman period in a new light. And I think that's incredibly important. I mean, the first piece I encountered by Tamari was a very short piece about the quarters, how the quarters were European invention. And it was a very short piece, but it completely changed my perception of the city. So Tamari's work, Issam Nassar, that works more on photography, and all the scholars that published in Jerusalem Quarterly, I think together create a really rich corpus that is not uniform in voice. I mean, you will find various different perspectives in Jerusalem Quarterly. It's kind of it's a good journal in that respect, but it does put emphasis on the city mainly through the eyes of inhabitants. I think that's the kind of important aspect. Open Jerusalem was important, I think, partly of kind of harnessing this literature and giving it place, but also to link this into various archives. And that includes also imperial archives that weren't used so much before. So that kind of, whether it's Abyssinian, Ethiopians, or Russian, etc., that on most people radar, it wasn't there. The most important thing they did was to digitize the minutes and the material from the Ottoman municipality, which is really an amazing treasure, and it's online. It's just as source material, and that's gives us basis to do other things and new things. So that's kind of broadly speaking. And of course, I mean, the work of Michel Campos, Roberto Mazza, Abigail Jacobson, and other scholars, various books that have been written in the last 20 years. So I think we're in a very, very, very different place today than we were in the early 2000s. Completely different place in terms of the historiography, and completely new view on the city that and that's where, if you go back to Yoshua Ben Aryeh's books, etc., I mean, it's very clear that vision that basically sees it a complete backwater, segregated, etc., which inherited that language from the British. I think we're beyond that. People could place themselves on various points of the spectrum, but we're beyond that kind of perceptions.
Great, thank you so much. Ari and Alyssa both wanted to say that they really, Ari was astounded and also very much enjoyed your book. And Alyssa said, thank you very much for such an interesting answer to her, a great answer to her question. So thank you very much. Thank you, Shira. Thanks everyone. I put the link in the chat for the subsequent events. Thanks everyone so much for attending today.
Thanks to Yair for writing such a stimulating book.
Thank you so much for the invitation and the questions and the discussion.
Thanks to you both. And we hope you'll join us again on October 14th for Hagar Kotev's The Colonizing Self with Libby Anchor. So thank you again for such a great conversation, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event.